Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my past week in reading. The first things that I read this past week were volumes 2 and 3 of The Woods. This is a comic series that I talked about last week when I had read the first volume. It is about a group of teenagers who are transported to another planet and are fighting for survival. It's written by James Tynion IV, and it is drawn by Michael Dialynas. I like the art style overall. The first volume I had issues with. I thought it was not complete enough of a story to really be a full collected volume, and I felt the same way about the second one. I think if it had been collected as an 8-issue volume, I think that would have been a lot stronger. By reading them broken up, I wasn't as taken with it. I did enjoy the third volume quite a bit more, but again, I feel like the story is really being hurt by being collected as 4-issue volumes rather than longer ones. So I do think it's a series that improves. I don't think the pacing was good, and I don't think the collection style is helping it much. After that, I read And Fingers, Call Me Ahab. This is a collection of stories that are all centered around historical attitudes and images of primarily physical disability. The first story in here, which is about an imaginary meeting between Helen Keller and Frida Kahlo, is one that I've seen a number of times before. I read it for the first time, I think 20 years ago, because I was sitting in on a disability studies class when I was in university. I didn't take the class, but I was a commuter student, so I had free time and I would occasionally sit in on classes. And that class happened to be one, and I ended up actually buying the book, which this was brand new at the time, which is a collection of stories, poetry, fiction, and nonfiction by a variety of disabled authors, which was used in that class, and I have carried this with me ever since because I really was impressed with a lot of this. And I think that's a story that is it's a very Disability Studies 101, intentional, on the nose kind of story. And a number of the stories in here suffer from that, which I think is somewhat tied to when they were written. Like, this book was published in 2009, but a number of the stories had appeared elsewhere before. There are a couple of stories that are about meetings between people. There's another one that's between Rosa Luxemburg and Antonio, I'm forgetting his last name, the socialist, which is similarly on the nose. It's very, here is where I am making this very clear point. And I think if you hadn't read that before, and 20 years ago when I was reading some of these stories then, I hadn't read any of that before, and it was a little mind-blowing, and now it is less so, because I think there is more of an awareness of that kind of thing. That said, there is a King Lear retelling in here, where the King Lear character is an older man dying of AIDS in the 1990s, and he has this moment staying at his son's commune that is lovely. That story kind of blew me away. The final story is the one that's mentioned in the title, which is Call Me Ahab, and it's playing with the idea of what would Moby Dick be like if it wasn't narrated by Ishmael and, interspersed with all of the randomness of here's a whale, here's the color white, here's the fishing industry bits. I thought that was really well done, and also it helps that I both love Moby Dick and like to analyze portrayals of amputees in fiction, so yeah, that was right up my alley. So I felt conflicted about this, because there were these two stories that I thought were absolutely brilliant. There was the one story that I had read already, and that I think is a bit dated now. Although even saying that, I think if you haven't read a lot of material about that, it might help for it to be as pointed as it is, because it definitely makes points about portrayals of for example, when you say Helen Keller, you don't default to she was a socialist. You default to she was blind and deaf. And why do we have that attitude towards her, whereas when you think of Frida Kahlo, you think artist, and you don't automatically think disability with her? And what does that mean in a grander cultural scheme? And I think that's probably interesting, even though I think it's dated. But because I had read that, I ended up picking this back up and rereading a good portion of this collection, which, as I said, is short stories and poetry and nonfiction. One of the nonfiction sections is an excerpt from Lucy Greeley's autobiography of a face, which was, I think, what made me keep rereading all of this after I'd picked it up, because I had just seen Ashley from Climb the Stacks had done a joint review of that, and then Anne Pratchett's memoir of her friendship with Lucy Greeley. And I'll link that video below because that was interesting. And then I kept going through the memoir section. And one of the pieces in here is one of John Hockenberry's stories about reporting from the Middle East and the unique challenges, both as an American journalist in a particular time and place, and the differences in the way people react to him as both specifically as a paraplegic and generally as a disabled person and as an American person, all mixed together, which made me want to reread Moving Violations, which is what that chapter is also taken from. This was another book that I think I read around the time that I was sitting on that class. This is less cohesive than I thought it was originally. I think this is one of these books that when I originally read it, I thought it was a brilliant package, and now when I read it, I think it's a lot of individually brilliant pieces that don't necessarily flow together perfectly, but it's definitely a very interesting look at multiple things. This is both a memoir of his life and how he became a reporter, but also is a memoir of his family's history of disability, because he has an interesting story in here where he has a conversation with his grandmother where she makes a comment. As a teenager, he was in a car accident and ended up with a spinal cord injury, and his grandmother at one point says to him, you know, we didn't know anyone in a wheelchair. But she actually had a son, so his uncle, who was institutionalized, who he later goes and meets him, and this guy is in a wheelchair, and they obviously knew him. And so he goes into a bit of the family history, which does a really interesting look at the way attitudes towards disability in general have both evolved over time and not evolved over time, as well as being the story about his career as a journalist and the reactions that he gets overseas, both as an American and as someone with an obvious disability. Not as cohesive as I originally thought it was, but it was still thought, I'm going to read my favorite couple of chapters, and I reread the whole thing because I couldn't stop reading it. It's funny because this week I also saw a number of people talking about rereading on some of the booktube videos that I watched, and I know a number of people are talking about a rereadathon, which I think might be Michael from Catalyst Reads who started that, but I saw a number of people talking about it. And I also saw a number of people talking about possibly doing more rereading this year. And it always surprises me when people don't reread very often, especially when they own a lot of books, because I can't figure out why you would want to own books if you don't reread them, because it seems like you could be much more of a minimalist. But I know I have seen videos from a couple of booktubers who say that they almost never reread, and yet they own hundreds or even thousands of books, and I do wonder why. Because I reread stuff all the time. Although it occurred to me I don't usually track the stuff that I'm rereading, so maybe I should. That's a question I would have for other people. Do you track the material that you reread? I also just started The Best We Could Do, and this is Thi Bui's graphic memoir of her family's life in Vietnam and then in California, I think, in the United States. I have not gotten very far in it. I think one of the most impressive things about this is I was reading about the history of it, and originally this was just a purely written story that she had come up with, and she didn't feel like it was dynamic enough, so she taught herself to draw so that she could illustrate it without any kind of cartooning background, which seems really impressive. What else was I doing? I also did a bit of hate reading, I guess. After I talked about a romance novel last week, a friend of mine, who I think is the only real-life person I know who actually watches my videos, texted me and said, I have the perfect series that you will love to hate. The series she wanted me to read was J.M. Madden's Lost and Found series, which is listed as romance-suspense-military. And it is just about as ridiculous as I thought it would be. It is about a group of disabled American veterans who start a private investigators company, and then they have romantic adventures, and it's ridiculous. The first book was free for the Kindle, and the prequel book was free on iTunes, so I downloaded them both, and I do indeed love to hate them. They're terrible, but I'm kind of entertained, and I might splurge and read more, because I noticed that you can buy the whole collection for about the price of one book, so I might buy the collection. Because I am loving hating them. They're not well done, but they're kind of hilarious. So if I do end up reading more of them, I think I'll do a video just on that, because it's kind of a weird, I don't do a lot of hate reading, and so that's a bit of a weird experience. And finally, I need to make a confession, which is that I have just let a whole pile of books become grossly overdue. And so I'm going to need to take them back to the library without finishing them. So that's going to be Zahra's Paradise, which is about the Iranian political protests of a couple of years ago. It is by an artist and writer who just go by Amir and Khalil. It's a graphic retelling of that event, and Yeah, I will have to take this out again some other time. The last of the brain books that I still have out here, which is Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, which is about the subconscious. I'm gonna have to take that back. And also Kapka Kassabova's Street Without a Name, which is her memoir of growing up in Bulgaria. She, of course, is the author of Border, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, which I thought was fantastic, so I was looking forward to this. I have 2 days left to read this Star Wars The Legends of Luke Skywalker book, so maybe I'll hang on to that and finish it, because I did want to finish that before I go see The Last Jedi. In any case, that was my week. I'll be looking forward to watching everybody's Friday reads tomorrow. Oh, and I was thinking about doing Strip Cover Lit's 12 Days of Litmus event, so we'll see. Maybe I'll get around to that. I'll definitely be watching other people's if they are doing them. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.